Hi, welcome to a new series here on Radical Bible on Acts. Well, you think of it as Acts of the Apostles, but that's one of the questions we have to look at when we look at the book. So as you see on the left side of the screen, it simply says Acts in my Bible program here with the New Revised Standard. And on the right side, I have general aspects of the book of Acts. And we'll see that's one of the things, and I'll just say right from the beginning, as Justo Gonzalez said many years ago, the book should probably be called Acts of the Holy Spirit, because it's much more about that than about the apostles. But I'm getting ahead of myself as we introduce this book, which we assume is from Luke, the author of Luke's Gospel, but maybe not. And that's one reason we're doing this introductory video. As you can see on the right side of the screen, I'm going to go over some of the general aspects of the book and also provide an introduction to a few of the commentaries that I'll be using for this series, in addition to the many articles and other things that I'll introduce as I go in individual videos. So here we go. Welcome to the book of Acts. So as you can see on the right side of the screen, I'm going to go through some of these things, and that's one of the first questions is who wrote it. And we assume it was written by Luke, but that's an assumption, and recent scholarship has raised the question about that. There are a number of reasons why, and one of the elements might be that they're not exactly the same theologically. The language is very different, although not so different. It's not as different as, say, the book of Luke and the book of Revelation. It's roughly in the same kind of writing, but there are differences, as we'll see. Whether the author is someone named Luke is another question. We don't know the authors by name of any of the Gospels. It's traditionally Luke, and traditionally reputed to be a physician, which is overstating it really. Most people think of it that way, but this is not like an MD. This would be like a healer in the Greco-Roman world. Certainly not someone like we think of, but an educated person for sure. Whether he was a Jew or a Gentile isn't clear, but most scholars would say he was probably a so-called God-fearer, which is someone who was not raised in the Jewish world, but was attracted to it, and perhaps wasn't formally introduced to it in a ritual way, but is going around with it and associating with those people. But we really don't know. That could be, as my notes show there on the right side, like Cornelius in Acts 10, or a soldier serving him, or like Lydia, the purple dealer who Paul encounters there in Philippi, or outside of Philippi, or Titius Justus, a Roman as well. But we just don't know. And that's related to the date question, because many scholars think the date of this is 2nd century. And you can see in the green box there, I'm suggesting the range of scholarly views is the earliest would be the mid-60s, before the destruction of the temple, based on the idea that Acts doesn't narrate the destruction of the temple. But that's not a definitive reason in itself. The latest argument for the latest date is around the 120s in response to Emperor Trajan. And Emperor Trajan, who was particularly upset about Jews not in Judea, but around the Mediterranean, the so-called diaspora, from the Greek word meaning to spread or to port, to spread out across, seeds, diaspora. Where Judeans or former Israelites were scattered around the Mediterranean, around the Roman Empire. And so because of various revolts in the time of Trajan, there was an increase in Roman anti-Judaism at the time, and some scholars see that Acts was written either by Luke or by somebody else to counter that, or to express accord with it, depending upon whether you think this book is anti-Roman or pro-Roman. And the 120 date would suggest a different author because it's perhaps 50 years or even 40 years later than the Gospel of Luke, and it's unlikely that someone could have lived that long. But that's, of course, is possible, and we don't know how old the author was when it was written. So those are just some of the possibilities, and we'll be looking at that as we go. Rather than trying to express a definitive answer now, we'll be exploring as we go what happens if we hear it as written in the 120s, what happens if we hear it as written in the 80s. The genre question next is one that many scholars go into great depth of. Craig Kester, whose first volume of his 4-volume, 4,500-page commentary on Acts, that was not a mistake on my part, 4,500 pages on Acts, spends more than 100 pages looking at the genre question. And one reason that's important, and may make your eyes roll, is the question of whether what we're reading is meant to be describing actual events that happened in the 1st century in the Common Era in the Roman Empire, or whether Luke or somebody else is simply making them up, or taking stories they heard and adapting them. And so in other words, how much can we read this as these things happened, and how much can we read this as this is this author's view of things that may have happened or may not have happened. And deciding the genre may be part of that. And rather than making a formal decision between one and the other, I'd like to just suggest the 3 possibilities that are all being combined here, and what's at stake. So, for someone like Keener who wants to try to prove that what we're seeing in Acts is historically true, including 3,000 people arriving for Pentecost and 120 people in the upper room in which they experienced the tongues of fire, he's inclined toward Greco-Roman historiography as opposed to biography. And he goes into great depth there. We'll look at the front of his book and him in just a minute to try to highlight how what we're seeing here is not, in contrast, a novel, as someone like Richard Purvo has argued at great length, but is meant to be conveying true events. But you don't have to agree with that, and we'll see that as we go. The issue of the novel doesn't necessarily imply that it's made up, and that's why I have it in quotes there, but it does suggest elements that are meant for entertainment. Dramatic stories, adventure, and humor. It certainly Acts as a very funny book, much more immediately funny than the Gospel of Luke, and more dramatic. Full of huge scenes with Paul and Barnabas in gigantic theaters and temples and shipwrecks and all kinds of drama and adventure. So whether those are fictional or whether those are meant just to make the story more appealing, we can't really say, but that would come perhaps from the popular novel genre. But there's also the possibility of historical novel that could come from each of the three major cultural contexts: Greco-Roman, Christian, which I should put in quotes there for reasons we'll talk about in a minute, but by the 2nd century it could be that, or Jewish, using historical characters and/or situations to teach a point relevant to the author's audience, as in the Greco-Roman historical novel where fictional portrayals of political heroes took place, or in the Jewish context, the biblical books of Esther or Job, which are plainly fictional characters but are trying to make a point, whether in Job about what happens to when bad things happen to good people, or in Esther about being in a foreign court. Or in a Christian context later, various so-called apocryphal acts, such as the Acts of Paul and Thecla from the 2nd century. So whether our book of Acts is one of the many books of Acts, or whether those are following up from this, we'll look at as we go. One of our challenges, and this sounds technical, but it's really important, is that there is no actual version of the book of Acts somewhere in the original Greek. There are three major text traditions, differing substantially in places. And as my note has, the most important are the Alexandrian and the Western. But as many scholars have noted, the Western tends to be more conservative. It tends to want to rope some of the elements of Acts to fit better into the Roman imperial cultural context. So we'll have to be looking at that as we go. The third is the Byzantine, sometimes known as the Koine or Syrian, and we'll look at. You can look at translation footnotes if you have a physical Bible or a study Bible that has that kind of thing. But we'll be looking at some of that as we go, because the text itself isn't what you're seeing on the left side of the screen. Of course, as an English translation of various versions of it, as the official versions like New RSV or New International do, when the scholars take account of all the major text traditions and often translate it one way and then put a note in the footnote to highlight what they're doing. So, turning to style. The style is much like Luke's Gospel. It's a very elegant Greek compared to, say, Mark or John, which are simplistic Greek. It is Koine. It's not the formal Greek of Attic Greek, the philosophical Greek, so it's in the more so-called street Greek of Koine. But as my note there shows you, using more than 200 Greek words not found anywhere else in the New Testament. And that's really, really unusual. I'm not sure in John's Gospel there are more than a few words used uniquely in John. If there are any at all, I'd have to look it up myself, and I haven't done that recently, so I can't answer my own question. But John uses very basic language. Luke and Acts use extensive language and specialized language. And the Greek text there, as you see, is 18,373 words, second in length only to the Gospel of Luke. And many scholars have suggested the length is one element that's constraining what Luke tells here, because whether it was in a scroll, one continuous piece of text has a great limit, or a codex, much like what we might think of as a 3-ring binder, but usually a 1-ring in the corner holding individual pages together. But that thickness depends upon how big a ring you can make and, of course, how much it weighs, etc. So there were various physical limits to how long you could make a text, and this is how long Luke made this one. Unique to Acts is the so-called mixed narrative stance. So the third person that takes place most of it, although the preface, as you can see on the left side, starts in the first single first person, I wrote, then it goes immediately into the third person. But later on in these sections you see here, starting in chapter 16, there's a we section. We don't know who the we is. The easy thing to assume is that it's Luke and the characters in the story, but when we get there we'll have to explore whether that's a narrative device or that's reflecting Luke's actual eyewitness experience to Paul's own journeys. And then, as I was noting, humor and adventure play an important role. And when I was teaching undergraduate biblical studies at Yale University, I'd often ask students, how many of you think the Bible is funny? And almost nobody would raise their hand. That's because we've often been taught the Bible is very serious. It's about going to heaven or going to hell and your behavior, etc. But this is very playful and very full of humor, and often dark humor, physical humor, slapstick, and all kinds of word plays and things. So be prepared to have fun with that, which connects with the audience. And a number of scholars have taken views on the audience. I have a very particular take on that, but you don't have to agree with me. I'll just tell you what mine is, and you can decide for yourself as we go through it. Because of the style, it certainly suggests, and almost all scholars would agree here, that it's meant for an educated audience, to show them that Luke is like you, that he can speak proper Greek and use big words, much like perhaps a college textbook would use more technical language or bigger language than a book for elementary school students or for just a general popular book. And that would imply class. That would be the upper class, because almost nobody would have been literate, especially literate in that kind of elite way, other than the upper class. And who among the educated upper class would even be open to a book like Acts? As many scholars have noted, Acts is not meant to be an evangelical book. It's not meant to try to convert people like the Gospel of Luke is. It's meant to be written toward people who are already committed to the way of Jesus, to show what it might look like in their world, perhaps decades or whenever later. And so I'd like to suggest that Luke is writing this, or whoever is writing this, we'll call it Luke, just like the gospel, for young adults in the Roman world who are expected to take their place in Roman society, moving the levers because of their elite status and education, to switch over and be traitors to that, to betray what they've been taught and to side with the Jesus followers. And we'll see how that plays out when Jesus followers interact with Romans and other elite people. But we certainly saw throughout the Gospel of Luke that Luke's Jesus had nothing good to say about rich people, and that money, mammon, was the root of all evil. So we can look at that as we go. And a number of key themes here in Acts of the Apostles. And this goes to the title I was noting, the Holy Spirit is leading the way, fulfilling God's boule, or plan, that we see a number of times here, first announced in the Gospel of Luke back in 730. And that plan is not detailed in the sense of every single detail as anticipated, and they just have to figure it out. But as we'll see, it certainly points them in a direction, and not often the direction that they would go apart from the power of the Holy Spirit. And we'll see that in number 2 here. First, the apostles and other disciples are empowered by the Holy Spirit to continue the work of proclaiming and practicing Jubilee begun by Jesus. So if the passage you can see here in Luke 4:16-21 from Isaiah 61, proclaiming the fulfillment of Jubilee, was the programmatic passage in Luke's Gospel, the parallel programmatic passage in Acts is from Joel 3, about the Spirit being given, and everybody will be a prophet. Old men and old women and young men and young women, and everybody will receive the Spirit and be a prophet. And that's really the theme throughout Acts. And they're empowered, as you can see, to do healing, to preach the good news, to cast out demons, to forgive debts and sins, and to practice covenant economics. In other words, to fulfill the Jubilee that Jesus proclaimed as his mission back in Luke. Women are equal co-workers in ministry, but not in leadership. And we'll be looking, as I'll show you in a moment, at feminist liberation perspectives that address that as we go. So there are a number of co-workers, and you see some named there, Tabitha, also known as Dorcas, in Lydia and Priscilla, but they're not the leadership. As we'll see in the beginning, Peter is speaking on behalf of the 12, will lead, and he and Paul will give speeches, but you will not hear women give speeches or making sharp decisions. Is that simply a function of the culture of the time that Luke couldn't see past? Is that meant to be a theological description of God's point of view? We'll have to decide that as we go. Number 4, the good news equals the resurrection of Jesus as the inauguration of Jubilee, and is intended for all peoples, not just ethnic Israel, but needs so-called translation into, quote, other languages. And as many scholars have noted, unlike Paul and other New Testament writers, the cross is not the key for Luke. The resurrection is the key. In fact, the word cross in Greek does not occur at all in Acts of the Apostles, but resurrection comes up a bunch of times. And that power of resurrection that converts those knows on the road to Emmaus, from despair to hope and excitement is what empowers Peter to go from, I don't know this guy, just a couple of months earlier, to now proclaiming on the streets of Jerusalem multiple times, as we'll see, even after he's been arrested and imprisoned. He has that courage now. And yet it will need to be translated. And I put that in quotes because it's not just literal translation, say, from Aramaic to Greek or other languages, as we see in the Pentecost story in chapter 2, but in other cultural context. And as I've written in my about to be forthcoming when I make this video book, Empire or Creation, A Choice of Two Religions in the Bible, in the Church in the United States, that's really one of the questions here is, what will it mean to gather together, to be bound together as a group in the Roman Empire if you're a follower of Jesus? Does that make you an outcast of the Roman Empire, or does that make you a good Roman citizen? And scholars disagree on that, and we'll have to see a bit more about that as we go. Number 5, persecution strengthens the community rather than weakening it. And we see a number of examples of that along the way, and that facing into that kind of persecution with trust in God is what it's all about. And then finally, Jesus' followers serve Roman society by providing a moral example grounded in Torah and gospel as a substitute for the dominant culture's patronage system. In other words, Luke is not seeing that little communities of Jesus' followers will be there when the empire falls. This is not an apocalyptic book like Revelation, but that they're seeds in the loaf and can leaven the whole loaf and make Roman society much more truly a divine society rather than one that they call the under the Pax Deorum, the peace of the Roman gods, which is the dominant culture in its hierarchy. So we'll see that more as we go. It also has an enormous number of characters, and I'll post this, of course, at radicalbible.net, but just to scroll through these alphabetically so you can see on the left side who they are and the right side something about them, and it just goes on and on. So if you lose track of who the characters are, you can go back to this, but there are just so many people as they go around the Mediterranean and encounter people all over. It's really quite a list. So as I was noting before, let's just look briefly at a couple of the books I'll be using. And this is not to the exclusion of older books, nor to the exclusion of articles and other things I'll show along the way. But these are programmatic for my whole series here in Radical Bible, and they've all come out in the last 6 or 8 years. So first on the list here is from Steve Walden, and you can see him there. I won't read all this. This is in the Word Biblical Commentary from Zondervan, which tends to be on the conservative side as a publisher in their individual books, but the Word Biblical Commentary is a very solid mainstream series, and so we'll be using that. I note that he goes through the first 9 chapters in 700 pages. But in terms of length, he's greatly outdone by Craig Keener, who's got a way of doing this. His book on the Gospel of John is 1,600 pages. Mine is only 500. And his 4 volumes on Acts are over 4,500 pages. The one that you see here, which is 1,100 pages, only covers the first 2 chapters. He has over 600 pages of introductory material. Needless to say, I will summarize his points there. And as I was noting earlier, some of that is because he's taking a more conservative view that's trying to show that all these things really happened. Looking from other perspectives, in addition to those technical in great depth. One here from the great Willie Jennings at Yale, who's done amazing liberation work here. And he takes this liberation approach, but his approach is also full of passion and joy and excitement. It's not a dry academic one, although he's certainly an academic as a professor at Yale. And so we'll be using Willie Jennings' wonderful work there. We'll also be using this work from two women, Linda Maloney and Ivani Richter-Reamer. I couldn't find a picture on the internet of Richter-Reamer. There's Linda Maloney, who's mostly been a translator, and her PhD is in American Studies, but later in life she took the theological turn and became an Episcopal priest and has now been doing her own writing in addition to translating earlier books by Ivani Richter-Reamer on the theme of women in Acts. So that led them to collaborate on this wisdom commentary, where they take a feminist liberation approach and note both the presence and absence of women in Acts. And finally, for this purpose, is Michael Traynor from Australia in the Earth Bible Commentary series, and his subtitle is About Earth's Children and Ecological Listening to the Acts of the Apostles. And in his commentary on Luke, which he calls Earth's Child, he sees Jesus as Earth's child arising out of the earth. So this is not a full commentary, it's just a focus on the elements where the earth is often missed as a character or as a subject in Acts of the Apostles. So that's where we're going to be going, and next video we'll start in chapter 1, verse 1, and is the first book, Theophilus. See you then for that. Bye-bye.